Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Live, India's voice to the world. I'm Lipakshi Khurana, coming up in the next 30 minutes. US President Joe Biden's steps continues unabated, mixes up the name Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, as earlier referred Ukrainian President Zelensky as Putin before correcting himself. Biden calls for end of Gaza war, expresses support for reaching a ceasefire, says there should be no occupation of Gaza once hostilities cease. Ukraine urges NATO to lift restrictions on targeting Russia. Zelensky calls it a game changer. China denounces criticism. Second BIMSTEC foreign ministers retreat to conclude today in New Delhi. India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Shankar urges new energy infusion in BIMSTEC to foster cooperation. And in sports, 7th seed Jasmine Paolini becomes the first Italian woman to reach Wimbledon final after defeating Croatian Donna Vekic on Thursday to take on Barbara Krejcikova, who earlier stunned former champion Elena Rybakina. And on to the details now. US President Joe Biden pledged long-term support for Ukraine on Thursday alongside NATO leaders and said he has no reason to talk to Russian President Vladimir Putin right now unless the Russian leader changes his behavior. US President Joe Biden vowed that the United States cannot retreat from the world and said under his leadership, Washington will not walk away from support for Ukraine. Last year, the G7 nations committed to the declaration for Ukraine's long-term protection. Shortly after, 25 additional countries signed bilateral security agreements with Ukraine. Now, a year later, over 20 countries, along with the European Union, have completed and signed these agreements.
I'm dealing with Xi right now and direct contact with him. I have no good reason to talk to Putin right now. There's not much that he is prepared to do in terms of accommodating any change in his behavior.
Well, at a news conference concluding the NATO summit, Biden said a strong NATO alliance is essential to American security. He also said NATO leaders and partners discussed the need for a new industrial policy among Western countries and how to boost the capacity, particularly of Europe and Japan, to produce their own weapon systems, and would meet again. Meanwhile, the solo press conference at the NATO summit in Washington since the debate night proved to be disastrous for Biden. He mistakenly referred to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as President Putin before correcting himself.
Now I want to hand it over to the President of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
Thank you so much.
And US President defended his health, saying he would take another neurological exam to determine his mental acuity if it is recommended to him by his doctors. Biden has been under intense scrutiny in recent days and has faced doubts, including from members of his own Democratic Party, about his re-election chances after a weak and faltering performance in a debate late last month against Republican former President Donald Trump. He mixed up the name of his Vice President, Kamala Harris, and his Republican rival, Donald Trump, too.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be Vice President, but I think she was not qualified to be President. So let's start there. number one. The fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again.
Biden also said that the Israel-Gaza war must end now, telling reporters his Gaza ceasefire framework had been agreed on by both Israel and Palestinian Islamist group Hamas, but added that there were still gaps to close.
For months, the United States has been working to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, to bring the hostages home, to create a path for peace and stability in the Middle East. 6 weeks ago, I laid out a detailed plan in writing. It was endorsed by the UN Security Council, the G7. That framework is now agreed on by both Israel and Hamas. So I sent my team to the region to hammer out the details. These are difficult, complex issues. There's still gaps to close, but we're making progress. The trend is positive. And I'm determined to get this deal done and bring an end to this war, which should end now.
And for more on this, Nick Harper joins us from Washington, D.C. Well, Nick, Ukrainian President, Biden's continued gaffes, majorly the verbal slip-ups have continued, calling Harris Trump and Zelensky as Putin, where he has not only taken wrong names, but also mixed the political opponents. So the trouble mounts for him more, is it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, these are embarrassing gaffes for the president, but I would say that he performed much better during this almost hour-long press conference than many people expected. Perhaps partly because the bar was so low after that disastrous debate exactly 2 weeks ago, when all of these questions about his mental agility, his fitness to be able to run for re-election came to the fore. He forcefully pushed back during this hour-long press conference against a whole host of brutal questions, suggesting that America's standing on the world stage was being diminished for his insistence of staying in the race. He said that he wanted to get the job done, that he would keep moving. And he said there was only one situation in which he would drop out, and that was if the polls said that he could not beat Donald Trump in November. And he said there were no polls that were showing that. And yet, despite all of this, despite the insistence that he is the best qualified man to beat Donald Trump and to bring the Democrats to victory in November, there are growing numbers of lawmakers within his own party who are saying he needs to step aside. And I think the next 24, 48 hours will be key for the president. Will we see a whole raft of Democrats come forward, now that the important NATO summit is over, to tell President Biden it's time to step aside? Because the calls to do so certainly seem to be getting louder, and it's not clear at this stage whether he did enough during this press conference to allay those fears and to quieten all of those Democrats who are saying it's time to suspend the re-election bid.
All right. As you said, growing voices within his party. Already, two leaders have joined the list of those who want him to withdraw from the race. We would want to get an assessment on where the campaign will go ahead now, as the calls for him to reassess his decision grow shriller and louder, as you mentioned.
I mean, it's very hard to tell at this stage, but I think we will see more Democrats defect over the coming hours, over the coming days. It may be a question of how long he can now stay in the race. I think it's important to note, a couple of days ago, Nancy Pelosi said that there was still a conversation to be had, because throughout this whole process, President Biden is saying the conversation is over. I am running for re-election. Essentially, let's stop talking about it. But Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker, a very influential Democrat, said really the conversation still needs to be present and ongoing. And she suggested that once the NATO summit was over, that would be the time to reconsider. We are now through the NATO summit, and I think many Democrats will be reconsidering and thinking whether or not they want Biden at the top of the ticket in November, because there is a real concern with his age at 81 and seeming to be getting even weaker by the week, it would seem, struggling even more with some of his sentences, struggling to formulate some of his ideas. There is a real concern that he wouldn't be able to finish a full 4 years in office if he were to be re-elected in November.
All right. Also, if we talk about Biden also called for end of Gaza war, extending support for reaching a ceasefire. He also said there should be no occupation of Gaza once the hostilities cease. What can you tell us about this? As Biden mentioned, there were still gaps to close.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he has been pushing this peace plan that he presented as an Israeli peace plan several weeks ago. And we still haven't seen the two sides coming together. Hamas and Israel still do not agree to that three-phase plan. President Biden said much of what had happened in recent months was due to that very conservative position that the Israeli government holds. Now, Joe Biden would like to see, or at least ensure, that there is no Israeli presence on the day after the war, that Israeli troops leave and then the Palestinians work out amongst themselves how to self-govern. But part of the problem is that the Israelis feel very differently. So although he's continuing to push these ideas, to present them on the world stage, the two sides who ultimately need to decide it, Israel and Hamas, are not agreeing to those proposals.
Also, what can we make out of his statement on continued support to Ukraine and a very forceful NATO statement against China?
Yeah, very forceful. On Ukraine, first of all, no real surprise about what we saw during the course of this summit. It was dominated by Ukraine. The fact that President Zelensky was here, mixing with world leaders, mixing with the Western alliance, it was expected that it would be at the fore. And as expected, the NATO alliance promised that pathway to membership to the NATO alliance for Ukraine. No timeline of exactly when that would happen. Plenty more financial and military support to the tune of about $43 billion over the course of the next year. F-16 fighter jets heading to Ukraine in the coming months for the very first time, and more air defense systems. On China, some of the most forceful language we've seen to date. We haven't seen the NATO alliance be as critical as it was here in Washington, D.C., really than ever before. It called China a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine, criticizing the fact that there was that strategic alliance between Moscow and Beijing, but also saying that because Beijing was continuing to supply arms, or at least components to produce arms to Moscow, that was furthering Moscow's campaign in Ukraine. NATO very clearly saying that it was looking at security not just in Europe but also in the Indo-Pacific, and calling out China as being one of the people who were continuing to propel this war in Ukraine forward.
All right, Nick, thank you so much for all that update from there. And moving on, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke with NATO leaders on the sidelines of the annual meeting in Washington on Thursday. As the alliance solidified additional support for the conflict-struck nation, Zelensky said Ukraine was very close to achieving its goal of NATO membership. NATO members issued a declaration in support of Ukraine, promising additional aid and pledging to support its irreversible path to NATO membership.
At this summit, we are putting in place the foundations for Ukraine to prevail, to defend today and deter tomorrow. Yesterday, NATO allies adopted a robust package of practical support for Ukraine, including a pledge of long-term security assistance. Today, we will take further decisions together with Ukraine, making clear that NATO support is built to last, and affirming that Ukraine's future is in NATO.
Well, the NATO summit has wrapped up in Washington with billions of dollars more in aid for Ukraine and major support on air defenses. Several NATO allies have boosted their domestic spending on defense, showing how they are prioritizing security at tense times, particularly due to concern over Russia. At the same time, challenges to U.S. President Biden's leadership overshadowed the end of the meetings. DD India's Caroline Malone reports for more from Washington.
Joe Biden, president of the NATO summit's host nation, had the final word on Thursday, describing the alliance as of critical importance to the US and transatlantic security. NATO allies focused on supporting Ukraine at this meeting, defending the country from Russia and China, who they say supplies infrastructure and tech support to the Kremlin. The Secretary-General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said that the message from the alliance is clear about China's responsibility when it comes to enabling Russia's war. Ukraine and the threats posed by Russia and China are of increasing concern to NATO's Indo-Pacific partners, who see it as an existential threat to the region. The groupings are pushing back with investment in defence and against cyber attacks and misinformation. Well, as for Ukraine, there are F-16 fighter jets on the way and more air defence systems from the US. NATO will station a civilian representative in Kyiv going forward and move a command post to Germany, where they will coordinate the supply of weapons to Ukraine. The US is also sending cruise missiles to Germany for NATO defence. Well, at the end of the summit, Hungary's Prime Minister, who's just back from trips to Russia, Ukraine and China, decided to go to Florida to meet with Donald Trump, the Republicans' presumptive presidential nominee. Trump has claimed he can end the war in 24 hours, a claim that President Biden and other NATO leaders have pushed back on. Well, Ukraine would need the Russians to leave their territory before any chance of peace talks. Well, all of this, though, is happening at tumultuous times for President Biden, who's being challenged by even members of his own party who are concerned over his age and lack of mental sharpness, with some even calling for him not to run again in this year's election. That's despite a successful NATO summit in the United States. Caroline Malone in Washington reporting for DD India.
And still to come in this edition of DD India Live. India's PM Modi interacts with prominent economists to gather views, suggestions ahead of Union Budget 2024. Veteran Indian shuttler Saina Nehwal stresses on girls to come forward and take up sports.
India keeps getting hotter and hotter, people will be looking for innovations to help combat the impacts of climate change and to cut the emissions that are causing it.
Zero tillage wheat, it builds soil carbon. It removes carbon dioxide from the air and builds soil carbon. It's like planting a tree underground.
What's happening here is preservation through conversion and transformation. I think you can see that very well here. You can take good experiences from it, and those are transferable.
Perovskite over silicon as material is the ease of processing. Silicon is something that is relatively energy intensive to fabricate, but this is something that can be done at close to room temperatures.
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Live. I'm Lipakshi Khuranan. Moving on, Nepal Prime Minister Pushkamal Dahal Aka Prachanda is heading for his fifth round of vote of confidence motion amid the certainty to lose it. Dahal is taking his fifth vote of confidence in less than 20 months in power. Majority weighing parties in the Nepali Parliament, the Nepali Congress, CPN, UML. And Janata Samajwadi Party have issued whip to its lawmakers to stand against the confidence motion set to be tabled in Parliament today by Prime Minister Pushkamal Dahal Aka Prachanda. If the Prime Minister fails to win the vote of confidence on 12th of July, he will have to resign. And in preparation for India's Union Budget 2024, Prime Minister Narendra Modi convened a meeting with economists and sectoral experts in New Delhi on Thursday. The meeting, which also saw the participation of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, was a key step as the government gears up to present its comprehensive budget for its third term on the 23rd of July. The pre-budget meeting was attended by notable figures, including Niti Aayog Vice Chairman Suman Berry and other members of the planning body. The gathering was marked by in-depth discussions aimed at shaping the economic direction of the country for the coming fiscal year. This budget holds particular significance as it is said to be the first major economic document under the Modi 3.0 administration. And amidst the row were alleged irregularities in national eligibility cum entrance test exam this year, India's Union Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan on Thursday met some NEET aspirants at his residence and assured them that the government will take necessary measures. Whereas Central Bureau of Investigation has arrested Rakesh Ranjan, who is believed to be involved in the alleged paper leak, and taken him into custody for 10 days. Earlier, the Supreme Court adjourned the hearing of the petition seeking the cancellation of the NEET undergraduate 2024 on Thursday until 18th of July. Well, India's Aadhaar card has become a pivotal pillar in the nation's digital revolution. As the largest biometric identification system in the world, it has brought about significant changes in the way services are delivered to over 1 billion people. Here's more by our correspondent Dibyendu Mondal on how Aadhaar is shaping the digital landscape in India.
Since its launch in 2009, Aadhaar has transformed access to services across India. With over 1.3 billion Indians enrolled, Aadhaar provides a unique 12-digit identity number linked to an individual's biometric and demographic data. One of the key benefits of Aadhaar is its role in financial inclusion. By linking Aadhaar to bank accounts, the government has ensured that subsidies and benefits reach the intended recipients directly. The direct benefit transfer system has saved billions of dollars by eliminating middlemen and reducing fraud.
हमने आधार कार्ड को, आधार नंबर को सरकारी योजनाओं से जोड़ा। हमने ऐसी सारी बिचौलियों को बाहर किया, पैसा डायरेक्ट किया और अनुभव आया कि करोड़ों लोग ऐसे मिले हैं कि जो है ही नहीं, लेकिन रुपये जाते थे, अरबों खरबों रुपये जाते थे। अब वो तो बंद हुआ, पैसे बच गए, लेकिन हमने कहा जो जरूरतमंद बेचारे बाहर रह गए थे उनको ढूंढ ढूंढ करके लाओ और ये बचे हुए पैसे उनके खजाने में जाने चाहिए।
Aadhaar is also revolutionizing the way people interact with government services. From applying for passports to filing tax returns, Aadhaar has simplified and streamlined numerous processes. It is now a crucial element in the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, a financial inclusion program that has brought banking services to millions of unbanked citizens. The impact of Aadhaar extends beyond government services. Private companies are leveraging Aadhaar for KYC processes, making it easier for people to open bank accounts, get mobile connections, and even secure loans. This has boosted the digital economy and improved access to services. The seamless services revolutionizing the digitization in India has attracted praises even from abroad.
I learned a bunch about what India is doing on this issue of authentication. And I think it's really exciting because the government has to be involved, as they are, but they have this foundation with the Aadhaar system that means they can do things that most governments around the world can't do. And I think India, just as India did this for Aadhaar, I think for telephony and electronic authentication, I think India could really show the world how to do it right.
Looking ahead, the potential of Aadhaar is immense. As India continues to innovate, Aadhaar is set to play a crucial role in areas like digital health records and online education. Its robust and scalable architecture could also serve as model for other countries looking to implement similar systems. India's Aadhaar card is not just an identification tool, but a transformative force driving the nation towards a more inclusive and efficient digital future. Dibyendu Mondal's report for DD India.
Well, some news from sports now. Barbara Krejcikova returned to a Grand Slam singles final 3 years after her only triumph with a stirring Wimbledon comeback on Thursday. That set up a meeting with Italian Jasmine Paolini, who continued to break new ground at the All-England club. Despite a wealth of major doubles success, Krejcikova came into the contest with Alina Rybakina as the lower-seeded underdog. However, she kept a cool head after a sluggish start against the big-hitting Kazakh to prevail 3-6, 6-3, 6-4. Meanwhile, 7th-seed Paolini earlier became the first Italian woman to reach the final after overcoming Croatian Donna Vekic 2-6, 6-4, 7-6 in the thriller, continuing her extraordinary year after last month's French Open runner-up finish. And veteran Indian shuttler Saina Nehwal believes girls should come forward and take up sports. Speaking during her Story, My Story talk at the Rashtrapati Bhavan in New Delhi, the first Indian shuttler to bag an Olympic medal on Thursday said that everyone should come forward and get themselves fit and take up various sports.
The girls especially कि वो और भी अपने आप को लड़कों से कम मत समझे, यू नो, जस्ट गो ऑल आउट देयर, जितना हो सके जिम करे, वेट्स करे, अपने आप को स्ट्रांग बनाए, और जितने भी स्पोर्ट्स हैं ट्राई करें कि आप आइए। मैं ये नहीं बोलती सिर्फ बैडमिंटन में आइए, किसी भी स्पोर्ट में। हमारे कंट्री में इतने सारे स्पोर्ट्स अभी अच्छा कर रहे हैं, सब इतने सारे लड़कियां स्पेशली अच्छा कर रहे हैं, ओलंपिक मेडल लेके आ रहे हैं। तो आई कैन सी सो मेनी ऑफ यू हियर सिटिंग जिनको दिल में डेफिनेटली आ रहा होगा काश मैं स्पोर्ट्स पर्सन बन सकती या बनूंगी ज़रूर आगे, तो उसके लिए मेहनत ज़रूर करिए।
All right, that's all for this edition of DD India Live, but let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. For those on the go, you can get all the latest news and updates from India and across the world on the DD India mobile app. The app is available on both Android and iOS platforms. Scan the QR code on the screen to download now. We'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Lipakshi Khurana from all of us here in Delhi. Thanks for watching DD India Live.